Welcome back, builders. In today's video, we're going to be checking out some of these pre-ported cylinders from California Motorbikes. Small engines have always fascinated me, and this is usually my answer when the question arises, why don't you just get a motorcycle? It's just not the same. And for those of us who enjoy staying busy, you can easily justify modifying a cheap $100 motor than you can something in the multi-thousands of dollars. A major aspect of what has kept me drawn towards two-stroke motors as opposed to anything else is port work. Bolt-on parts which add performance, efficiency, reliability, or practicality are always nice to have, but port work is one of the few major modifications that's easy to obtain for anyone and cheap, which truly make a motor your own. At face value, you wouldn't think there would be too much room for customization when you're just cutting some aluminum to specific measurements. But once you start digging into the detailed fluid dynamics of what goes on inside these tiny little motors at different RPM ranges, you begin to realize that every shape, angle, and millimeter you cut in various different ports can have a significant impact on the motor's behavior, among other things. In my own personal experience, I haven't made any paperweight cylinders yet, but I've certainly had some with better performance than others. And because there's so much room for customization in these cylinders, I'm curious to see what California Motorbikes has settled on. At the time of recording, they have two options in their shop. A simple bolt-on performance upgrade with a wider and higher exhaust port, but utilizing the same piston port intake so no additional hardware is required. And what I'll be testing in today's video, their race-ported version. This has the wider and higher exhaust, but it has an intake trench as well as a boost port. The intake trench on this one is generous and wide, so a windowed piston is not required. However, I will be using a windowed piston with mine for any added benefits that might have. Also, it's already on the motor and I'm lazy. But this does require a reed valve, so I'll be using the CDH power reed, which I've already had on the bike. For the most part, this is going to be a direct swap, changing nothing else on the bike except where required when it comes to gaskets. Both setups are using the NT Speed carburetor with what I believe is the stock 70 jet. Of course, not to be overlooked because it has a big impact on the performance of both of these cylinders is the MZ65 pipe. The only other notable performance upgrade on this build is the PowerStorm ignition system from DLH Performance, providing a better spark. We'll be covering a few more details here in a moment, but first let's get some baseline performance numbers and riding dynamics out of the way with my own custom ported G4 cylinder. Overall, I feel like this is a solid performer. There's room for improvement depending on what you're going for, but I'm happy with the results. This build has a targeted cruising speed of about 30 miles an hour, somewhere between 5,800 and 6,200 RPMs. Pinning full throttle for short burst will get it up to 8,000 RPMs and a top speed of 42 miles an hour. This is to be done for only short burst, of course, because, well, 8,000 RPMs on a bicycle is a good way to send both yourself and your motor to an early grave. Having been in a few low-speed accidents myself, and witnessing other builders get into more severe accidents, my days of trying to push 50 miles an hour on a bicycle are gone. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the cylinder from California Motorbikes. A side-by-side comparison shows these both appear to be G4 cylinders. Neither of them have had any work done to their transfer ports as far as I can tell. Exhaust porting between the two shows some pretty dramatic differences. I've gone with a wider but shorter exhaust port, and CM's gone with a taller but narrower port. Still wider than stock, just not as extreme as mine. The narrower port design on the CM cylinder will likely give it more life, as after a few hundred miles, mine is already starting to show some degradation on the liner just below the exhaust port. I believe the higher cut in their exhaust port will give it better potential for higher RPM performance, assuming everything else is optimized. On the intake side, we see the most dramatic differences. They've gone with a wider trench. Mine's pretty narrow in comparison, and this is mostly just due to lack of experience, as I don't know how wide you can safely make this. The boost port on the CM cylinder is pretty conservative, whereas I've turned mine into a fifth transfer port, opening at the same level as the two lower transfer ports on the G4. For a fair comparison, I'll be adding a fresh set of piston rings to the new cylinder and keeping the old rings with the original. Due to inconsistencies in the G4's manufacturing process, the only notable difference in this swap is the squish gap. My previous cylinder is running a squish of just under 1 millimeter. On the CM cylinder, I was only able to get the squish gap down to 1.2 millimeters, and to do this, I had to replace the base and head gasket with high torque silicone. Using high torque silicone as a head gasket replacement is still experimental for me, but it's been holding up for hundreds of miles on a few different builds without any notable loss in compression or oil leaking around the head. But for me to further match the squish gap to my previous cylinder, it would require decking the head. It's a simple and easy process, but it takes some time, and I just don't have that right now. There are a few more details about the CM ported cylinder which I feel are important to point out, but we'll come back to those in a few moments. For now, let's go ahead and get this out on the road to get some baseline performance numbers and riding dynamics. This was my first ride on the CM ported cylinder. Overall, I'm impressed with the results. Now, do keep in mind that this is before break-in, literally the first ride out-of-box performance, so it doesn't have quite the top end as my previous cylinder, but as most of you know, cylinders will tend to pick up a little more performance after a few tanks of gas. I'm also pretty sure that after I deck the top of the cylinder to get the squish down to just under 1 millimeter, it'll pick up a little more power. At full throttle on a flat stretch, I noted 7,800 RPMs, and keep in mind, I'm a 210-pound rider. This should put me just about 38 to 40 miles an hour. That top speed number's not going to impress any speed demons, but where I noted the better ride quality was at cruising speed. With 6,000 RPMs, this thing was a bit smoother than my ported cylinder, which for me is only good news because that's where I spend 90% of my time on this bike. It also seemed like they managed to pull this off without sacrificing much, if any, low-end torque, as the motor appeared to have no issues pulling me up to my cruising speed rather quickly. Some additional information I'd like to point out that's probably relevant is I'm assuming that California Motorbikes is porting their cylinders to match to their Wildcat motors. Compared to a stock cylinder, you'll likely have a performance increase using this on any motor with a 40mm stroke, but I've noticed that on my Wildcat motor, the stroke is about 39mm. It's just a hair under 40. And that might not sound like a big difference, but on these motors, the stroke has a lot to do with port timing and where they make their measurements for their cuts. So to make a long story short, if you're using this cylinder on one of their Wildcat motors, there's a good chance you'll get optimum results. For me, this test was more about curiosity than all-out performance numbers. I wanted to see what somebody who's been in the business for quite some time was selling with their pre-cut cylinders. As up until this point, I'd only had my own work done on cylinders to compare against each other. And seeing that his results give better cruising speed operations than mine gives me something to work with in the future when I'm measuring my cuts. Now, at the end of the day, I enjoy cutting my own cylinders as it adds an aspect of customization to the motor as we talked about earlier, making it my own. But this might be a good option to somebody who's interested in porting, not sure where to begin. They could use it as a template or a starting point, see what other builders are doing to their motors before cutting into their own cylinders. And when you consider that California's ported cylinders aren't really much more expensive than a stock G4, if it's time to do a top-end replacement on your own build, you might look into their piston port design to see if it gives you any notable improvements. For now, I'm going to go ahead and put some more miles on this top end to break it in and see if we get any more performance out of it. And then I'll look into decking the top of the cylinder to get our squish gap down and see where it compares against mine after that. That'll be an update video in the near future, which you guys can look forward to. Anyways, I hope you guys got some useful information out of today's video, or at the very least were mildly entertained. And until next time, ride safe.